I'm Dr. Heather Bray. I am a lecturer in science communication at the University of Western Australia, but I've been involved in science communication, some vaguely connected to agriculture for about 20 years or so. I'd hate to imagine where it is, but right over there on your left is me as a PhD student. So my PhD was funded by the pig industry. I have a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from the University of Sydney and a PhD in Animal Production Science. And I did work as a scientist for a few years with a postdoc in the Netherlands. But like many young scientists, you start to think, is this really what I want to do with my life? And I thought science communication sounded pretty fun. I grew up in the generation of watching The Curiosity Show, watching Sir David Attenborough, watching a whole range of people and thinking that looks really cool. So I then moved into science communication. I did work at the Science Centre in Adelaide for a little while, and then I started working for a cooperative research centre that developed genetically modified crops. The Department of DAFWA, as it was then, was actually a participant, so was Murdoch in that. So I think it was about 2008 was the last time I was here. So it's changed a little bit since last time I was on campus. This is actually me in Esperance. There you go. I do come to WA. So that's at a crop update showing producers how to extract DNA from wheat germ, but that was really to stimulate a conversation around the use of molecular markers and other types of genetic technologies in crop development. I have moved back into research because I'm really interested in how we improve the way we communicate about science and technology in agriculture. So this is me at Heartfield Days in South Australia, keynote presentation, no slides, beer tent off to the side there, so I had some stiff competition, talking about things like social license in agriculture and people's understanding of technology, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about that today. But I also do present my own research and do engagement activities as well. So my area of focus particularly is the role of gene technology and animal welfare in food production. So I don't get invited to many parties. Then obviously the gene technology space is very hot right now, with Food Standards Australia and New Zealand considering pre-market assessment for gene-edited food if that's your bag. So today I want to focus on two main areas within this workshop. Science communication is a bit like an iceberg. We see a lot of activity on top of the water, lots of people doing the communication. Often workshops focus on this is how you do the thing, but there's a whole heap of stuff under the water, which is really that strategic thinking about why should I communicate? What do I need to say? Is this type of communication even right for what I want to achieve? And so that's that under the surface part of the iceberg, which I want to spend the first half of the workshop on today. So really starting to think strategically about communication, because social media as a tool is only going to enhance what you're already doing, and it should fit into the suite of communication tools that you are already using. And then in the second half of the workshop, after we've had a little bit of a break, both for people online, because focusing online for more than an hour sort of does my own head in, we'll start moving on to looking at specifically at social media. And our platforms of choice today are going to be Twitter and a bit on LinkedIn. Before I go too much further though, for both the people online, hopefully there's a hand raising function, and also the people in the room, who would say that they use social media regularly for work? Most people, okay. And what about personal for those who may not have put up their hand, or just who uses social media for personal reasons? Yeah. Do the two talk together? Is that the same stuff? No, I'm getting lots of shakes of heads in here. I don't know whether people are able to put something in the chat just to get a sense of the community online, but we do tend to separate ourselves personally and professionally online. I do as well, and that's one of the things that we'll be talking about a lot more in the second half of the workshop. But I just wanted to gauge where people were at. Hopefully there's something for all levels of participant. Like if you're a bit of a proficient user, hopefully there's something that you'll be able to take away from today, which is like, oh, I didn't know that. And if you're new, hopefully you won't see that world as too scary and quite as frightening as it may seem. And so I really want to focus, as I said, for the first half on thinking strategically. And there's a fair bit of research that shows that scientists don't like to think strategically about their communication. As scientists or knowledge makers more generally, we have this idea that knowledge should be shared and it should be made accessible, and the idea of being strategic and framing our messages and thinking about audience starts to feel a bit like advertising, and, you know, they're the work of the devil, right? So we need to sort of lose some of that thinking, because when we actually start using language like tactics, it might sound really foreign, but these are things that are important if you want to achieve impact. Thinking strategically allows you to set goals for your different projects, allows you to prioritise activities. We all have very limited time. We need to think really carefully about where we invest our time and our effort. And also built into strategic thinking is, of course, evaluation. And if you don't aim at something, you're never going to know whether you got there. So that's really just a kind of way of thinking about communication that I'm hoping to share with you in this first half of the workshop. So the mantra that I live by and that I use in all my teaching when I'm talking about strategy is purpose, audience, message. Now, these things are so intrinsically linked. They're knotted together. They're like that classic Gordian knot that it's very, very difficult to talk about one without the other two. But I'm going to try and talk about one first, and that's purpose. Now, there might be a whole range of personal and professional reasons why we might be communicating about our science. I'm going to be using science generally for research or whatever area you're in, but we're talking about science communication and really professional kind of communication here. So there may be a whole range of reasons why you do it. They may be personal. A lot of scientists, when I really ask them why do you communicate science, go, well, I like talking about it. I like sharing what I know. And so they get a lot of personal and intrinsic reward out of talking about science. But it also might be, no, I really want to drive practice change. You know, that we live on one blue planet, we've got to work out how to make food and fibre sustainably, affordably, the food's got to taste good, it's got to be healthy for us, and it's got to be made in a way that doesn't use up all the resources on the planet and is also culturally and ethically, socially acceptable. So we're asking agriculture to do a lot of things. So, you know, there may be a range of reasons why we communicate to do with those kind of goals. You also might want to be communicating because you want to get promoted and you want to demonstrate your impact through engagement. So there might be a range of reasons. But more generally in science, we have a series of goals, and I think it's really important to recognise that these are different because they will require different tactics. So you may want to just create awareness of your thing so that people might know more. You might want to influence attitudes, deepen understanding, educate, motivate action, change behaviour, build trust and credibility. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, particularly in an ag context as well. And I think this kind of classic example, flatten the curve, is a piece of communication. I don't even need to explain what that is, but you could see that that probably hits 2 or 3 of those kind of roles. It might have been raising awareness, it might have been educating, it's definitely trying to motivate behaviour. And the language that we wrap around that piece of information may be directed at all of those different goals so that the different audiences for that can each receive that different message. So thinking more deeply, awareness. It's usually it's trying to inform people about something that they don't know. And it's like, I haven't heard about this before, now I've heard about it. It's just information, just informing people. And quite often we think that that's enough. But if we actually want to motivate behaviour change, we need to go a lot further than just informing. And I'll come back to that a few times in this workshop. Education and understanding, and yes, that's me. Again, as part of that the molecular plant breeding CRC with my hand in a blender. Oh, no, that shot's not actually me with my hand in a blender, but we were using this as our community engagement thing, because if we said, come and talk to us about genetically modified crops, we didn't think anyone would talk to us. So we were trying to arouse curiosity and go, people would come up and go, what are you doing? And like, haha, you're mine for 3 minutes. And I would tell them all about the science of GM food. But what we were trying to do there was educate people into understanding what it is that we were trying to do. So a way of sort of checking whether you're aiming to educate somebody might be the kinds of questions that you would ask them afterwards. Like, do you know enough about this now to tell a friend? You know, or can you apply this knowledge in a different way? So this is very different to the have you heard of it? It's like, do you actually understand it? These are different things. Again, if you want to change behaviour, and I've got a bit more information on what these persuasive appeals and the perceived behavioural control are. But if that's your goal, then a good place to look is marketing, because they're really good at making us do stuff we didn't think we wanted to do. And I watch the Gruen show, whatever they're called now, religiously. I think it's a fascinating place to sort of watch about how people talk about changing people's behaviour. There's a lot to learn in that. But the way, if you want to change someone's behaviour, again, it's a very different kind of approach to educating people. And if you want to change societies, again, different audience, different methods, different approaches. I put this up there partly because I've been interested in animal welfare, and some of the tactics that activists use are quite interesting to see. You may not agree with them, but again, they're interesting to observe in terms of the way that they're able to motivate change. And I think the changes in the egg industry are really interesting to watch over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, certainly throughout my career in studying out with a degree in animal production science to what's actually happening now. So trying to change what society views as acceptable, that's a big task. And again, requires different tactics. So I wanted to start off with my first little interactive discussion. In your tables or in the breakout groups that Tina's about to send you to online, there should be small groups of you together just to have a bit of a 5-minute chat with your peers about what kinds of things you might want to do in your communication. Now, remember I said it's so knotted together, you're going to be wanting to go, but it depends on who I'm talking to and it depends on what I'm talking about. But just broadly, what kind of things are you wanting to do? Are you wanting to mostly change behaviour? Are you wanting to raise awareness? Can you see that these things might be different? So 5 minutes at your table. I'm going to set my timer. Say hi to your neighbours as well. And we're just sort of talk generally about what kind of things you might want to achieve in your communication. Off you go. Talk to yourself.
What's actually going on? They hear that they're going to break new world out of sleep or something like that.
Right. Yeah, it's automatically assigned to this justified. I thought it would auto distribute it. They've only just been assigned.
Yeah, no, what I'll do, we're
That one, there were a little bit about audience, that they can do a combined one, because I've added that, and I'll try and send out some more.
yeah.
Sorry, I realised. Just to check. They've just gone in. But their group people are high. About 29. Oh, yeah. And then it was oh, great.
It almost comes off.
Do they reckon they'll need more time online?
3 of them might come back out. I heard that from the Stakeholder Analysis. And you've got the one saying maybe they couldn't get in until they clicked on it. So it's not like they're just their comments already. There's a few actually quite a lot. Do that. And because I can't
Okay, everybody, that's 5 minutes. So if I can bring your focus back to me, please. Okay, I'm just trying to be really strict with time because also obviously with our online group, walking around the room in here, I did hear a range of things around persuading, educating, managing reputations and things like that. Did anyone want to share the kinds of discussions they had at their table? Overwhelming me. Okay, Fran, what kind of things were you saying? Now, we might have to just move the camera to you.
Yeah, yeah, great, perfect. I think it's too low to probably be able to
probably won't.
So we talked a little bit about different levels of what we were trying to achieve. So there was a corporate level of, we want our reputation built. We wanted to be recognised that we're cohesive or collaborative, and we're trying to improve the sector as a whole, down to I want to influence somebody coming to an event and turning up and being interested enough that they would see value in that. So there was a bit of profile type stuff and at different levels, so corporate versus individual.
Yeah.
And then there was I want to be able to outline to people what value there is in turning up to my field day.
Yeah. Absolutely. And this is where, again, like I said, it's impossible to talk about one aspect of this without starting to think about audience and message as well. But we have to start somewhere, and often finding your why, what's motivating you, the reason why you're actually doing project A, which of course might be completely different to project B, C, D, etc. Was one of the things that I was hoping to think about. Now, online, we had people nominating the teach, educate, the persuade, the engage, the arouse. The range of comments were around this, but yeah, as we mentioned, there was definitely I mean, motivate arguably can sort of fit in there, but there was a few in here that were sort of not necessarily on the board. But I think the main thing that I wanted you to take away from that exercise is, again, just thinking critically around, well, what is it that I hope to achieve with each of these different things, and that there's usually not one thing. Our temptation is often to try a one-size-fits-none approach, and that this actually takes a little bit of work in terms of thinking through the range of activities you might be engaged in. So I'd like to move on to audiences now. So who are we speaking to? It's probably more than one person. So one of the things you'll need to do at some point is sit down and work out who your stakeholders are. And I love a visual pun. There are several in this particular presentation. A pun or a bad meme. Yep, but tish, I'm here next week too. So yeah, knowing who your stakeholders are. And quite often, unfortunately, it comes down to things like who funds your work. And you're going to have to come back and communicate to them. But who cares about it? Who's actually invested in that project? And who should care about it? Sometimes they're not the same kind of things. Who has the capacity to do something with the information or to act on the information that you have? Quite often we might be talking to people and talking to a group of people that actually don't have the capacity to act on the information that we have or that we're trying to give them. So sort of thinking through that as well. And obviously these relate to purpose. So there's a couple of exercises that you can do to start to nut this out. One of them is a stakeholder analysis. If you Google these, you'll find these kinds of things written up. That's fairly standard communications, strategic communications kind of tools. And thinking through what you put on the matrix here is power and interest, but it could also be like funding, or it could be slightly different things. But you'll end up with a group of people who are probably not that invested and that you don't need to waste your time with, versus a group of people who are highly invested and highly influential, who you will need to focus attention on. And just thinking through in terms of priorities, well, where should I be investing my time? Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that we ignore the wicked problems that do seem hard and difficult to move, but it's just in terms of, again, thinking about your purpose, whether you make sure that you go for the low-hanging fruit every now and then, as well as working and chewing away on some of those hard, challenging problems. So it's really just, again, a combination and a choice you make as to, well, I can get a win here while I'm still working away on this thing as well. So thinking through who your stakeholders are is really important. And as we've already discussed, coming up in the discussion about purpose, is that there's levels of audiences as well. When we're talking to an individual, it's very different to when we're trying to actually talk at the level of an organisation or a community or a network of people. And it's also sometimes difficult to know whether your communication has been effective the more people that you're trying to talk to simultaneously. So thinking about the level of communication, if you're wanting practice change, are you really going to have a conversation with every single person, or are you going to be able to talk to a network and let that network do some of the work for you and communicate that message on your behalf? So are there ways for you to think more strategically about, well, if I talk to these influencers, for example, these key people, then I don't have to talk to everybody. Now, I'm not going to ask you to have a think and a think, pair, share at this point, because I'll come back to this afterwards as well. But just to sort of, again, to think through, I'll be asking you shortly to think through who it is that your audiences might be. And you might find that there's areas of commonality on your table. I'm making some assumptions about the kinds of people that are at this workshop, which is why I'm focusing on agriculture, and I've got some soils examples, but you may be from different areas but still have similar audiences. So these are just, again, a sample of some of the standard types of stakeholders that people in research tend to be involved in, or people in science or science organisations. And then the last part of that purpose, audience, message, good old Pam, is the message part. What will you say? Now, arguably, this may not still be at the strategy level, but I'm still talking broad messages here. But this also is almost starts to be at the tactical level and how you might think about targeting specific messages to specific audiences. But at a fairly high level, what are your key messages for those audiences to achieve that goal? Now, there's been a lot of criticism or discussion in science communication about a way of thinking about science communication known as the deficit model. So the knowledge deficit model of science communication says that people are lacking information, and this is why they do the thing. And if we give them the information, they'll do the thing that we want them to. They'll change their behaviour. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of that, and that's kind of what this meme refers to. But that doesn't mean to say that giving information is never a good thing. I wouldn't be standing here right now doing what I do if I thought there was no point at all in sharing information or in trying to encourage or educate people. But what the deficit model or the critiques of the deficit model say is that we really need to remember that there are a whole range of other things that influence people's opinions and attitudes and behaviours, and that raising awareness of an issue alone may not translate into the behaviour change we're looking for. And for me, as someone who was in the trenches trying to convince everybody that genetically modified food was a really good idea by telling them the science of how a GM food was made, that's a classic example of the failure of the deficit model to actually to demonstrate that it is effective. So that's a strike against the deficit model. And a lot of the ideas around how we should communicate science, we really learned from that GM debate. Similar issue could be, arguably, trying to convince people to get vaccinated by telling them how an mRNA vaccine works. Now, that is going to be convincing for some people, but for others who may want to know more about, well, you know, or people who may have trust issues, or people who may not understand the science, or people who may be concerned about other reasons, just telling them about the science is not going to persuade them to change their behaviour. It will for a certain group, but not necessarily everyone. So that's where the critique of the deficit model is. So it's just a cautionary tale. If you're thinking about just raising awareness of a controversial and complex issue, it may come back to bite you if you're not actually thinking about other issues like trust, which I'll come to shortly. Framing. Framing is something that the media does and everyone doesn't like it, but it's just what they do. We know that there's a reason why one story running on the ABC is told completely differently to the same story running on Channel 7. And that's because those guys frame it differently. We probably tell a different story about events to our mates than we might to our, depending on how old you are, your parent or your son, in my case. So, you know, we instinctively frame. And this meme that Dolly Parton put out, it also refers to social media, and it's just classic in that the way that we portray ourselves to different audiences is a classic example of framing as well. So framing is, you know, highlighting certain things, trying to reduce complexity down into a few simple ideas, and this is the way we instinctively communicate all the time. Now, often again, scientists are reluctant to frame because it's like, no, there's this absolute and objective truth, and that's what I need to be telling. But you would probably tell your science slightly differently to an investor than to a producer, for example, and highlight certain things. So framing is an active choice we make when we talk to people about our ideas, about our information. One of the other, like I said, I like a daggy meme. So thinking about framing and framing our message to our audience. One of the oldest ways of trying to persuade people is going back to the old persuasive appeals, the ethos, logos and pathos that Aristotle would talk about in terms of how I'm going to motivate an audience. And depending on which type of nerd you are, there are two trinities here. This is often used in storytelling to represent different aspects of it. But that was really just to remind you, logos, ethos and pathos. It's almost like, you know, it's like I like both kinds of music, country and Western, you know. I like both kinds of science fiction. Ethos depends on the character of the speaker. right at the very beginning of this presentation, I tried to credential myself in front of you by saying I have a long career in science communication about agriculture. So I was making credibility claims there so that you would think, hopefully not just think, but that you would think I knew what I was going to be talking about. We tend to do this all the time. But we are in an era where potentially, trust me, I'm a scientist, may not cut it anymore. And this is new for us. We used to be able to rely on that as an authority claim, as a credentialing claim. And scientists are still very highly trusted. Producers are very highly trusted. So the war on science rhetoric I don't necessarily dive into, but we are still trying to understand the fallout from the internet and social media and how people's authority is judged and how their trustworthiness is judged. So credibility claims are important for some audiences, but again, depending on on other audiences, it may alienate you and you may have to work on a slightly different tactic. But ethos, credibility claims, they're still persuasive. Logos, using logic, the logic and the rationality of the speech itself, of the information. As people in science, rationality means a lot to us. Logic means a lot to us, but beware the logical fallacy, as we have an example here. I love those websites, by the way. So logic and rationality will only work if it's an audience that actually values logic and rationality. So trying to explain or persuade someone who is being irrational with logic is going to be very challenging. It's unlikely that they will respect the logic of that because they're already going into the fallacies. Your logical fallacies, they're probably already cherry picking. The correlation is not causation kind of things. All of these sort of logical fallacies quite often come in and can appear like rationality to people who have not had the opportunity to develop their critical thinking skills. So use logic and rationality if your audience speaks that language, but be careful. There's other things that can look like it as well. And pathos. So pathos is one that scientists tend to not use. It can be highly motivating. I still want to cry every time I see that polar bear, so I am sorry, it's very triggering. And that's the problem, is that sometimes pathos can be overwhelming and it can completely disenfranchise us, make us feel like there's no sense of agency. So quite often in the floating garbage patches and things like that, that problem is too big for me to solve. And it can actually really turn us off from the message and not be persuasive at all. So use emotion sparingly. Be really careful. Sorry. Now, this is a piece of research that came out in the 80s that has become my mantra. And this is really, again, going back to that idea about the deficit model and some of its critiques. This is, again, something that advertising uses all the time. You can see here that attitude is not directly linked to behaviour. Attitude may predict whether you intend to do a behaviour, but whether you actually do it or not actually relies on how easy it is or how easy you think it is. So perhaps sometimes our communication may not be about trying to change someone's attitude, but it may be about trying to inform them that it's actually much easier to do than they think it is. If we're actually trying to drive behaviour change or make them think that everyone else is already doing it, the subjective norm. So we might want to be communicating about, hey, look at everyone's doing this type of practice, and it's really easy to do. It's not going to cost you much, rather than focusing on attitudes or maybe even educating people. So thinking, again, really about if behaviour change is your thing, then making sure that people know that it's easy to do and that everyone else is doing it too. The Keith Cup was a bit like that. When everyone started to do it, you'd sort of feel bad if you didn't have one. And recycling and things like that, they're trying to make that easier, for example. Just a couple more. Debunking misinformation. So this is coming back to where I was talking about using logos and logical fallacies. These guys, if you just Google debunking handbook, make sure you use the 2020 one. So one of the psychologists at UWA is involved in this. It's an international consortium. They've been studying misinformation, and their debunking handbook is a really useful tool in understanding strategies for correcting misinformation. So this flowchart shows that, first of all, is the misinformation already out there or is it coming? Watching. And how sticky is it? Is it definitely sticky? And if it gets down to that, then what you need to do is debunk often and properly. So quite often we start with the myth, say everyone thinks this. They're saying don't start with that because people remember that. Start with the fact. Then talk about the myth and why it's wrong, and then end with the fact again. So that try and make sure that fact is sandwiching the myth, and we don't say everyone thinks this myth and reinforce that when we're talking about it. When I was first looking at this a few years ago, we were worried about if we kept saying the fact that we would drive people further away with boomerang effects if they were re-entrenched. It seems that some of these backfire effects aren't as big as we thought they were. They haven't been able to be replicated in psychology, and they're saying always correct the misinformation. The chance of driving them further away is minimal compared to the chance that you might actually correct the misinformation. Yes?
Heather, if it's an emotive myth and it's out there and you want to debunk it, is it best to go with a particular framework to try and do that? Like, are you doing it again in an emotive way, or are you doing it, the science is this, blah, blah, blah. I'm just trying to wonder, is there a strategy around, depending on how the information has gone out, how you then debunk it?
So just, did everyone online hear the question? Just checking, otherwise I can quickly repeat it. One of the things that Uli was saying in the presentation about it, so it's really a question if the myth is also a motive. If this is a really contentious issue, what kind of framework can we use? Is it one where you go in and debunk it with logic, or should you try other things? Definitely it's more effective if the speaker is trusted. Now, again, credibility claims may not work with that group. Shared values would probably be a much more important strategy to go, look, I actually am worried about my kids' health as well. I'm worried about the health of my family. I know you're worried about that too. I'm scared of this. I know you're scared of this. Let's have a chat about it, and actually making sure that you're already seen as a trusted and credible source is probably the most important. That's what Uli was saying in the presentation, but I encourage you to have a look at the latest version of the Debunking Handbook. Speaking of shared values, that I think is a really important step. There's been a lot of interest in this in agriculture. The idea that making sure that our audience knows that we actually care about the same issues. Sometimes the credibility claims actually reinforce an us and them, and you're actually wanting to make sure that people know that you are actually affected by the same things as your audiences are. So in my area, I care about food. I'm a mum. I worry about what I eat. And for producers to think about the same sort of stuff too. In fact, the dairy industry really started marketing on this hard. It was like, I care about the things you care about. I care about animal welfare. I care about nutrition. I care about all these things. So shared values are a really important tactic, and it sounds horrible to say tactic for things like shared values when you really also want to be authentic in your communication. But and that's a trade-off that we all have to make as communicators around authenticity as well as trying to achieve an end. And trust and trustworthiness is another, I think, interesting concept that has received a lot of attention in ag communications. It's interesting that we seem to have replaced the idea of a knowledge deficit with the idea of a trust deficit, and that now it's not, that there's still a gap. I'm about to show you that the trust in primary industries is still remarkably high in general, but there are things that the community is concerned about. But I think it's important to actually understand what trust is. Trust relies on an optimism. I'm going to hope that you don't do anything to harm me, because you're going to be in a position where you can. Like, I'm asking you to do something I can't do. I'm asking you to produce my food because I can't do that. So I'm trusting that you'll do that and hoping that you'll do me no harm. And then that's going to be based on something. Why would I trust you? Why do I trust, the childcare worker, with my child? Why do I trust the hairdresser? Like, yeah, go to town. Why do you trust the plumber? Why do I trust these people? Well, because usually they've got some sort of established reputation and some level of competency. So I can establish whether they're telling me the truth. And again, this is sometimes harder on social media to know whether people are telling the truth. And this is one of the things that's become more challenging in the world generally, is establishing the truth claims that speakers are making. Their commitment, the idea that, yes, on an ongoing basis, I deliver, but that I'm also competent to do the thing that you're asking me to do. And so these are the assessments we make when we decide to trust someone. It's not based on knowledge. If I knew that you were going to be a trustworthy source, then I wouldn't be trusting you. Like, trust actually has to rely on some level of ignorance and some level of vulnerability. And it's not, you can educate people to trusting you to a point. You can educate them that, you know, okay, yes, I'm competent and my commitment and I'm telling the truth. But the bottom line, to be trusted, you just have to be trustworthy. That's the bottom line. And I think this is still where ag industries more generally are still trying to just come to grips with, okay, well, what is it that we're trusted to do? There's been some awesome work coming out funded by AgriFutures looking at trust. Kieran Moffat used to work for CSIRO, who spun it out. They've been doing a 3-year-long trust in rural industries project. You can see that the trust is high. So this includes forestry and fisheries, by the way, when we're looking at rural industries. And you can see that what drives trust, environmental responsibility, is really, really important, and being seen to be environmentally responsible. But responsiveness, actually, the community actually feeling like they're being listened to by ag is really important. So sometimes when agriculture does that, oh, those large hay sippers, they don't know what we're talking about, might really not necessarily be helping ag's trustworthiness in that situation. And the products themselves are also trusted and highly valued. People like food, not a lot of alternatives. So, you know, there are some things that people are generally trusting to do, and that, yeah, the community values that. So when we start hearing this rhetoric about, oh, the community doesn't trust us, the data does not stand up to the interrogation on that. And I think we really need to start making sure that as a sector, we're doing the things that trust us to do. So we're now at our next little discussion point. So I'm combining both audience and messages here to take 5 minutes to just start to think about, if you've got your audiences, start thinking about purposes and messages. Now, I've got create a table or a matrix there. You don't have to do that, but I'm just sort of starting to suggest that what you might want to do after this workshop is go away, start to think about all your little projects and start to develop a bit of a matrix about what it is and who it is that you want to speak to. But just in your small groups and in your breakout rooms, think, pair, share for 5 minutes or so, thinking about your purposes and your audiences and the types of key messages that you might want to think. And these are big messages. You know, they might be reputational. For example, you know, we might want to be telling the community that we can be trusted to manage shared resources, because for many, soil is considered a shared resource. Okay, you know, producer might own the topsoil, but, you know, we know how long it takes to develop. It's going to have to be around for generations, similar to water. Water is also considered a shared resource. So those sorts of things. But you also might want to be telling the funders that you're awesome to work with and that you should get lots of money. Okay, 5 minutes, and I'll start that now.
As quickly as I can. I'm opening up, but it usually takes a few seconds.
That's right, I'm running about 5 minutes late.
Yeah, it's been great. It's been really well. You have great comments as well.
Oh, good.
Yes.
That's right. Exactly.
This is just getting they're just a quick regroup. Recap.
So they've
got questions as well after this.
They've lifted the down.
So we still want to send them on break at about 5:25, 5:30?
That's what I have, guy.
It's a big factor. If you look at like.
That's what I mean. They'll want those references. But I'll do it as like a Word document.
Yeah.
I'll get some references. Yeah, they're all the same.
I don't know if you've got that money.
Like I'm the format and the observer at the same time. Everything is better. Yeah, and you've got a good mix of fish and ag. Yeah, I reckon. That's why I remember saying water's a shed. So still needs 3 or 4. Yeah. All right, we'll finish up and then break. Okay, if everyone can come back to the centre of the room, please. Because we will be breaking shortly for a longer discussion, but I didn't expect everyone to be talking shop while they're also having a drink. Did anyone want to share the kinds of discussions starting to think about, you know, whether there's any wanted to reflect on anything, starting to thinking about the communication as a type of matrix and thinking about different audiences and different key messages, the types of key messages. Anyone want to share in the room?
We had a brief I commented that while we want to get to agronomists because they get to more growers than we can,
Yes.
we want to be seen by the funders to be doing this.
Yes, yes. So the comment in the room is that talking to a network, so talking to agronomists and getting out there, but then you still want the funders to see that you're also heavily invested and engaged in that interaction. Unfortunately, there's the doing and the seem to be doing, and there still is, but there still might be a way, again, to communicate back to the funders that you're giving them more bang for their buck by communicating to the agronomists. And that doesn't mean that you don't have your ear on the ground as well. You are also talking to producers directly, but that it's more efficient and more effective, or that it's a better use of their investment to actually work through consultant networks, through agronomist networks, for example. There might be a way to kind of twist that, to frame that story. Did I say twist? I meant frame. I meant frame. Anything online, Tina?
I'm looking at the comments.
Are there any comments?
Let's have a look. None yet. Oh, one from James Maloney from Black Mountain. Can you define SLO here?
Oh, sorry. Social license to operate. So that was really hot and still is actually, again, in the ag space. So again, starting to think about, well, what is the relationship between ag, broadly constructed, and the community? And in fact, science also has a similar relationship. What is the relationship between science and society? So social license to operate sort of grows out of that corporate social responsibility type of idea, in that society gives organisations permission to exploit shared resources to make profit. So it's coming then from that, we're looking at mining or that particular sector into ag, where again, society says, yes, you can farm your land and you can look after that land and be the steward of that land and make money off the food you grow, that sort of stuff. Now, there's many in the industry who says, we don't need a social license, it's us, it's our stuff. But it's this idea that there is a contract in negotiation in terms of what is permissible to do and what is not. And of course, in ag, it really hit the news with live export, because there was an industry that lost its social license. It was operating, and then suddenly that license was revoked. And the idea was that, no, you are actually breaching the contract. You're breaching the conditions that we allowed you to operate under. You've allowed abuses of animals. So we're going to take that license away. And so I think this is why in some ways the industries have almost moved past social license to operate and into trust, because maybe it doesn't quite represent the relationship between ag and society, or industry and society. It may be better if it's like a single organisation like BP or, Woodside. It may better represent that kind of relationship. There was a PhD that's just come out of the University of Adelaide in ag economics that's been looking at social licence in ag, which I haven't read, but I know that she's been publishing out of it. But I've just noticed that with AgriFutures, for example, they bypassed social license and went straight to trust in terms of investing, and I tried to understand the basis of this relationship. So that's what SLO means. It's also really big in fish, obviously. That's another area that's been looking at it, as well as, particularly farm fisheries, as well as ag, land-based ag more broadly. Are there any other questions? We do have a couple minutes for questions before we finish up for a break.
A follow-up comment from James. Conversely, there's also the need to establish a social license or trust between a research organisation and producers, right?
Yes, absolutely. And this is partly too what I mean about, that's because I've got the other one in my hand. It's like, where are my glasses? They're in my hand too, right? That research organisations and science more broadly too. For example, in my area, gene-edited food, is that something that, we're really engaging the community on? Are they having the opportunity? And that's why we're talking about things like upstream engagement these days, and that can be challenging to do. So I think just to summarise before we do have a break, so was there a question?
Sorry,
Yes.
Dale came up with a really interesting point on the community level and how it's really hard to evaluate.
Yes.
Like, you know when you do a bad job because like
Yes.
live export kind of scenario, but you never know how you're going really otherwise.
Yeah, and I think understanding efforts on that broad scale, community scale are very, very challenging. That's almost why I said, well, activists seem to be able to do it, but we don't seem to be able to do it in the other direction quite so easily, and it's really difficult. And that's almost why I'm suggesting try to narrow that down into different audiences, whether it's a local versus, you know, everyone. Like, try to break everyone up, or the public up, into specific audiences, because the public is just too nebulous. But it might be quite challenging, and that's why I also didn't want to say that we should ignore that because we can't do it in 3 years. Obviously, yes, we still need to do it too, but while you're doing that, you probably want to have some closer targets closer to home. But I think, just to summarise, the idea of thinking strategically about your communication is really just asking you to, or asking yourself a series of questions about your different projects. And like I said, one of those projects may be your own career advancement versus, you know, making sure that this project goes. But thinking about why you're communicating, who are you talking with, what do you want them to do? A lot of people say to me, I want to make the community care. Like, but what does care look like? Does care mean they're going to vote in a different way? Does care mean they're going to shop in a different way? What does care look like? Because caring is actually a behaviour change. Or do you just want them to feel nice, like think of you in a warm, fuzzy way? What do you want them to do? What do you hope to achieve? What do you need to say? How best to communicate? We're going to start talking about social media soon. How will you know if you've made a difference? I'm not going to be talking specifically about evaluation here, but that is a crucial part of the step, at actually seeing whether your efforts worked. So moving on to the second part of the workshop, where I'm focusing on social media. Of course, one of the questions we need to ask is whether social media is even appropriate as a tool based on your audience, your purpose and your message. So assuming that once you've done your matrix, that there are actually some things that suit social media, let's dive in. And often you hear sort of this idea that, you know, science isn't finished until it's communicated. I personally don't like that saying because, again, it doesn't imply, it doesn't, you know, include the but to whom and, you know, and to what end. So I really need to have all of those elements in there. But I guess one of the aspects that I want to talk about today is using social media to leverage your research publications, which may not be applicable to everybody here. But also, I think just definitely the completion of the project or is not necessarily the finish line. Now, I just want to preface social media with a quick reminder of how rapidly this particular field has changed. I know that's not a particularly good slide, but what I wanted to be able to capture was the way we tend to think about generations these days. There's the greatest generation, the silent generation, the depression babies. Boomers are up to 1964, Gen X, of which I am one, 1965 to 1980. We get left off everything still. That's the whole Gen X thing, right? So when we look here, the things that we lived through with the end of the Cold War and Live Aid, the first personal computer, VIC-20 in 1982, right? And who else? Yes, thank you. Cheer to the man down the back there. You know, I was a PhD student when we first got email. So that's starting to really age me, and I don't feel that old. And then we start to look at the millennials. Remember, the millennials were not born at the turn of the century. They became adults at the turn of the century. They used to be called Gen Y, but they didn't like that name, I guess. Entitled people. But they've lived through, you know, 9/11, and smartphones are very much part of their toolkit. And then we've got Gen Z, you know, and I look at my son who's in final year of uni, he's turning 21, was born in 2000, he's classic Gen Z. You know, they have a very different appreciation of technology. So when we think about the old, this is going to make everyone feel old, those of you who are my age, when we think about the way that technology has developed and look at where some of these generations are, Gen Z will never remember a time before social media. And I'm seeing that in my uni students now, in my second years and my third years. They process information in a very, very different way. When I talk about blogging as a concept I used to teach in 2012, they don't know what that is, or they think of that in a very different way. They don't necessarily understand that a blog is just, and they can't tell the difference between a blog site and news. They don't see that as different to anything else that's out there. They think of a blog as something that one individual can have, but they don't necessarily see a blog as something that an organisation can have. And so they process information in a very, very different way. I was starting to teach about Twitter for social media in 2012, 2013, and giving workshops similar to this by, that sort of time, 2013, 14, 15. But I was in the Research Centre for Molecular Plant Breeding, where I was going to conferences in around 2006, and they were telling us that Web 2.0 is coming. The interactive web is coming. This will change your world. And they were right. And I still don't think we've really processed that. It's interesting as somebody working, on society's attitudes to technology. And here we are debating about gene edited food. No one asked us whether we wanted the internet, or no one asked us whether we wanted social media and what kind of havoc that could play on society. Where was that focus group? But isn't that interesting? I reflect on that all the time. Now, I've got TikTok on there, and it was in the blurb. I am not going to spend any time on TikTok today, because that's a whole other workshop. But it's interesting to reflect that that's actually been around for some time, and it's really only been the last few years that that's really taken off. But again, thinking about whether things are fit for purpose and your purpose audience message, like, is TikTok really where you want to go to communicate with your audience? Probably not at this point. I'm still just taking a step back and watching what happens there and seeing how that could be used. But of course, my students are all on it. So that's, again, where I'm almost, it was funny when my master students started to say, are we the older generation now? I don't understand what the undergrads are going on with TikTok. They're like, are we the older generation now? And I'm like, yes, you are. So they were never on Twitter. But they were on Snapchat. Remember that? Yeah, who's on Snapchat anymore? So So that's kind of gone. That's still some Gen Ys. But this is a rapidly changing space. In terms of social media platforms, YouTube is still the most popular by far. People are still accessing content by YouTube. YouTube this year, in July or last year, can't remember now has the vertical video short form sharing. So they've tried to move into TikTok's market space. So you can have YouTube shorts and do your smartphone generated vertical short film video on YouTube.
This is going on YouTube afterwards as well.
Oh, and this is going on YouTube afterwards on the most popular platform. So yes, thank you for the reminder. Facebook is also still incredibly popular. For me and for, I think, most people my age, this is still somewhere where you connect with people you went to school with. And when my parents turned up on Facebook, that's when it just died for me. So I no longer share anywhere near as much as I used to on Facebook. But I still communicate about my work there, because what happened was the community that I met on Twitter then migrated onto Facebook. And so Facebook used to be only for people that I'd physically met and that I knew. But once I'd had a relationship with people for 5 or 6 years on Twitter and talked to them very frequently, then they moved into that space. So you can see going down, Twitter is nowhere near as popular, but it's a narrower band of users. And I think it's still very influential when you think about professional social media. LinkedIn, again, similarly, is lower, but again, important for professional communication. I don't even know what Viber is. But it's not very popular, and this is probably, TikTok has already moved. So choosing your platforms, is also a really important thing. So thinking through the demographics and the audiences that are on each of the platforms. So Facebook is an older generation now, LinkedIn's more professional, Twitter's more professional, TikTok younger. So Twitter is certainly not young people. I've found, since I've been teaching, probably since about 20 17, 18 undergraduates are not on Twitter. The postgrads might be, but the undergrads are not. They're getting on Twitter when they become postgrads. They're not natively on it. But I think the kinds of considerations, in addition to your purpose, audience, message, and thinking specifically about audience, think about how much time you have. And the reason why I'm suggesting that is that something like TikTok requires you to make content. Now, the good thing about that app is it's a very easy app to use in terms of making content. But if you don't have the time to be shooting video, maybe that's not the platform for you. If you want to share other people's video and you like sharing images, then the other platforms are better. So thinking about, is it something that you want to just dip your toe in, have a quick look, oh, those people are talking, I'm going to share a few of those messages, or I'm doing something right now, I'm going to take a photo and upload, or do you have time to really devote to creating content specifically for sharing? My assumption is that most of you will need it to fit into your schedules rather than to fit yourself into their schedule, if you know what I mean. It has to be something that you can do fairly quickly and easily. So that's one of the main reasons why I am focusing on LinkedIn and Twitter today.
So Heather, question from the chat log from
Yes.
Sarah. Do you have figures of most used social media platforms by agriculture industry? Seems like Twitter is very important.
I don't off the top of my head. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody has collected that data somewhere, particularly like Meat and Livestock Australia, those ones that are running social media stuff. There was some work that was being done around social media use in ag. I agree that Twitter is quite important because I think of it's the way that it can create communities. And my experience with ag and Twitter is been really positive. So why researchers tend to use Twitter, most of them, the data's getting a bit old now, but you can see that most of them are using it to post content and to read content and to share, and often not, tracking metrics or actively discussing. It might be just this is what I've done and then pull back. And I think it is important to actually have these conversations to build those communities. And I think that following discussion, so scientists do tend to sort of share something, but then sit back and sort of watch and follow generally. But I think it's important to remember that Twitter is mainly a networking tool. It's often seen as a broadcasting tool, but it's really much more about creating these small networks. And this is where, again, the communities that can form around hashtags, for example, can be really supportive. So this is just the Scientists Who Selfie hashtag. They were trying to show pictures of them at work and sort of demystify that idea of being scientists. But a report done in around that same sort of time, 2014, 2015, again, looking at how academics are using social media, showed that they're using it, or Twitter in particular, showed that they were using it to connect, to establish networks, to share information, to promote the work of others, and also that giving and receiving of support and publicising and developing their research. That tends to be the main reason why. And I think because Twitter works well for that, it's sort of that self-fulfilling prophecy about why that's important. How I use Twitter, and you might notice if you really scroll through my feed that I've kind of been less active in the last few years, but I still use it for all of these reasons. I use it for networking, for finding peers, for socialising, getting tailored news, relevant papers, conferences, etc. I'm not going to read all of those out, but there's a range of things. Probably some of the most important for me have been identifying issues. It's a listening thing. So again, probably more so in my previous job than now, listening to the kind of conversations that producers were saying, listening to their frustration, listening to some of the community debates that were happening led to research projects on animal welfare. Finding research partners. One of the partners on that linkage grant, that animal welfare linkage grant, was someone I met through Twitter. So it can have impact in research, absolutely. In my bio, you notice that I have aligned myself very much with my employer. It's because even if you try not to, you still will be. You could put thoughts of my own, it doesn't matter. You will always be identified, as being employed by that institution. There's a case in Victoria, where somebody said some things horrible, and she was like, oh no, I didn't say it on behalf of my organisation, but she ended up losing her job, and then quite rightly too, because what she said was appalling. But you will always be identified with your employer, so why not promote it? Why not use their credentialing to add credibility to you? Yes, I had my birthday up there, which I only realised yesterday. I was like, oh, I didn't realise I was telling you about my birthday, but I've already told you guys how old I am anyway. I don't swear, which I do in real life, so again, my curated self. I don't get political. I try very much to sort of stay on a curated professional version of myself. I will promote my friends, my colleagues' work, absolutely, share my own, promote the work of others and causes that I'm interested in, but to a point of not being political. And it's very much a professional me. I don't tend to talk about my personal life. Some people have, personal bios up there. You can see that I don't have anything about my family situation or my personal situation up there. That's what I've chosen to do on this platform. Facebook is very different. Instagram is different again. LinkedIn is much more like Twitter. And when I've been talking about communities, the way we think about this in scholarship is that Twitter allows the formation of micro-publics. Now, sometimes you hear the word filter bubble. It's a similar concept, but not so much the idea that, but I think I like the idea of the micro-public better, because we're really talking about it as being smaller versions of the public that are connected through these follower-followee relationships. This data is getting a bit old now. It's from 2017, and it's by some data people up at QUT, and there's a conversation article, that sits behind this. But what I absolutely love about this is that this is clusterings of people who are sharing an interest because of their hashtags and things like that. So it's cluster analysis. Now, hopefully you can see this online, but if you go all the way over here, now I've just moved out of the camera. You notice that agriculture is out on its own in a little island. So right over the other side there, and I will use my thing even though I said I wasn't going to, we've got ag out on a little island. It is closest to activism and up there with politics, but it's completely separate from food. It's a long way from food. Interestingly, South Australia obviously is also talking to itself. It's not as isolated as Corn Island out here, or teen culture, because no one talks to, they just talk to each other. But what I find fascinating is the distance between food and ag. Those communities are not talking to each other. The ones that are more closely related, obviously, is ag and cycling. So this says, and I've often said to audiences too, where's science? There's no science there. Well, hopefully science is just everything. But I just think it's fascinating that there is a community of ag that is identifiable on a network map like this. I haven't seen an update of this, but I'd be curious to see if it's still there. These guys were writing around about Ag Chat Oz, which was it's still as a hashtag, but that was very much a community. They came together once a week. We had online chats on Twitter. I've met some amazing people through that all over Australia, and that community was really, really supportive of each other, an amazing community. So, and you still see people who I met from that time, sharing tractor pictures, or at the moment, waterlogged paddock pictures if you're in the Western New South Wales. So yeah, there's still an amazing community out there. So if you're going to use Twitter strategically, which I know sounds a bit icky, but what you're trying to do is build an audience for your research or for your messages. Same as the media does, you want to build an audience that is going to be the people that you want to speak to and that you think are going to be the ones who need to hear your messages. And so finding that community of people, starting to build that audience is really important, starting to interact with them. So who should know about your work? Whose work are you interested in? Where does that community hang out? Do they have a hashtag like AgChatOz or any of the other kind of hashtags that are relevant? I looked at soils as a hashtag. There was a few things there. There's a couple other hashtags that I think are bringing people together across. but are there specific hashtags or events that bring those communities together and go and find them? What do they talk about? What kind of hashtags are they using? Follow them, participate and share, join in. That's the way to build that audience. Yes?
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying. One thing I've sort of heard about quite a lot is, especially on Twitter, is people trying to follow as many people as possible and hope that those people that you follow will then follow you back. I was just interested to hear your thoughts on that, because I know there's a lot of people trying to get a better ratio of followers to follow, or followers to who you follow.
Yeah. So the question for those online was about using following lots of people as a tactic to get people to follow you. I definitely think following people, most people feel obliged to return follow, but you'll be able to see them a mile off. There is a limit if the ratio is bad, because I was somebody said, oh, I want to follow you, but I need someone to follow me first. And it's similar to LinkedIn, really. Again, there's a lot, you get asked a lot to friend people on LinkedIn, and then as soon as you do, there's a DM saying, hey, do you want to buy something? And it's like, oh, that's not why I wanted to connect. So for me, again, LinkedIn's something that I used to limit to people I physically met, whereas Twitter, I didn't really care about that so much. I definitely think following people as a strategy to gain followers is a useful strategy within reason, but make sure that they're the people that you want to talk to and that you actually have something interesting to say to them and that you are interested in what they're saying. Yes?
I guess just to add to that, when I'm on LinkedIn or Twitter, I actually only follow the people I think are the people I want to hear from and that I trust. And by doing that, I constrain the people who follow me. They're not going to get the person who's just got ad hoc people everywhere. So I might have 1,200 followers, I'm only following 100. Because A, you don't want all the rubbish feed because it takes hours to plow through. But B, it's also about that trust and reputational link. And if you're linking to people who are random, you disable that, I think.
And I think that's why that bio information is quite important as well, so that you can enable people to, so people can work out where you fit as well. I'm just going to keep moving on. I'm a bit sensitive to time. So roughly my own Twitter audience, and this has changed. I've looked at all the times I've given this presentation since 2012 and the balloons have kind of shown shape. But I think roughly there's 3 or 4 main audiences. One is definitely people in ag, and that definitely used to be the biggest. I think gradually scientists and science communicators are starting to overtake that, particularly with me moving into my current job. But the journalists were an important group, and certainly all of the rural press journalists. I have received DMs to say, can you be on Country Hour tomorrow? And that's kind of the position I wanted to be in. So all of those rural journalists, but also other journalists. HAS is Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, so that's the research academic field in which I sit. So that's people who are doing similar research to me. Now, the reason why it says Adelaide people and other randoms, as you noticed, South Australia had an island, that there was a very strong social media community in Adelaide that I was sort of following when I was there. I haven't quite done the same to Perth because I haven't found the Perth people, but there would be just people I'm like, oh, you look interesting. So I do that sometimes for Twitter. And so they just don't fit in. They're the other category. But that's kind of the audience that I want as well. I definitely want the ag audience, definitely want the scientist and science communicator audience. They're the ones that, again, I'm communicating with, and I'm still really interested in the journalists and how they work. When you're using social media, either Twitter or LinkedIn, tends to be a professional voice, but thinking about voice is really important. Again, there's been some research, this is getting a little bit old now, but this idea of different personas. Over here, the uncontainable self, that's Trump, whereas, this is a university vice chancellor, though today I did this, no discussion. And most of us probably want to be somewhere between that networked self through to the comprehensive or teaching. We're a version of ourselves, but we're at work, and yes, we're going to have a conversation with people in our break time, but we'll also be on message. These people are difficult to manage. I think when we were talking outside earlier about some people, they were starting to be in this phase. So if you're managing a posse of tweeters, you want them all to kind of try to be a bit more on that comprehensive side. But I think the formal self is a little bit too rigid. And growing your audience, we've discussed already following people as a strategy, but not being one of those people that follows a million people and goes, hey, thank you, following me. Competitions and events, and there may be one announced later today. Rotational curation accounts. These are accounts that, and this is one of the reasons why I think Adelaide was so strong, was they had sort of an Adelaide people account and everyone would take turns. There's also one Real Scientists, where a different scientist hosts that for a week. Now, when I hosted that, there was 13,500 people on that. There's way more than that now. So rotational accounts are a way to build your profile if that's the kind of thing that you're interested in. Tweeting through conferences and using conference hashtags, that's a really important way to grow your audience. And also just sharing your own stuff. Eventually, with some hashtags, you will grow. And be considered to be a generous sharer of information. Generosity is still really rare and still really important in terms of both being a nice person but also establishing a reputation. But what can I share? So Avid Podcast is a Twitter account that this year and last year decided to run this thing called SciComm September hashtag. And these are the challenges that I think her name's Amelia, she set. I'm not suggesting that you do SciComm September because it's now November, but these were just examples of the kinds of things that they were doing. And you can go back and have a look at that hashtag of people in all sorts of fields sharing their day. So these are just meant to be ideas of the kinds of things that you might want to share, even if you think, or like me, like I haven't written a paper in a couple of years because I've been busy, so I haven't got anything to say. Well, there's all of these other things that you can do. And I think remembering that Twitter is still a medium, but it's still part of the media. So news values and things still apply to some extent. You can be educational and think about, okay, well, how can I be educational and what kinds of things can I show? Informative, the news announcements, but also things like human interest. The photos of, hey, look, I got visited by somebody today, or those kinds of things, or here we are. Actually having a human interest in in what you share, I think is really important. Opinions and thoughts, again, making sure that you're within the code of conduct policy of your employer, and also just cool stuff. They might be like, oh, I just saw this really cool thing, I'll share it. So just some very, very quick examples. In researching for this workshop, I started following Vanessa Wong. She's a soil scientist in Victoria. She often has pictures of people out in the field. I mean, the stuff you guys do being outside. I mean, when you're a science communication researcher, it's like me and my computer, or a bunch of people who can never be identified. So I can't really share a lot of my stuff, but you guys being outside for most of your things, you've got great vision. So lots of, like, here we are outside, here's some soil samples and those sort of things. This is a video that's quite educational, just a little one. And this one, I put this up, this is Dan Murphy's, but even I could see what a gravel soil was based on that particular video. They've thrown the soil up in the air and you hear all the rocks just go crash. And so that's just a little tiny second video, but it's really interesting. I found it engaging. And I decided not to do soil science at uni. So, that sort of really quick and dirty kind of stuff also still fits in. LinkedIn is very similar in some ways to Twitter. It has the features of most social medias, social media mediums, but it feels less personal in some ways than Facebook or certainly Instagram. It's more like Twitter. But one of the things that LinkedIn has that I really wanted to point out is there is the ability to blog and to post and create posts within LinkedIn. So you have the ability to publish articles within LinkedIn as well as share all the other content. And I think that's a function that a lot of people are underusing. And I think that could be another way for you to just write a quick thing about what's going on and actually use that posting, that article function within LinkedIn. That's probably the main thing. Yes?
was just going to comment on that particular aspect, because if you put in the link to your journal paper, the altmetrics impact score of a publication, if it's retweeted, put on from Facebook onto LinkedIn, your altmetrics or the impact score of your publication goes up. So all of a sudden you have a publication in the top 1% of papers in that discipline area, just because people were interested to go to your journal link.
And I've got that coming up.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to go, I've got an example of that very one thing, but this is, so that's what part why I wanted to draw your attention to it. That blogging function is really useful when you're talking about driving impact towards research. Now, I did want to have another little breakout session, but I think for time I might keep going, if that's okay with everyone. But I think the bottom line, before I move on to the research thing, the bottom line with using social media is, like wine, unfortunately, you have to drink a lot to develop taste. And to work out how to use social media, to work out what works, what doesn't, what you like to do, you need to spend a lot of time developing taste within that medium. So that means watching, observing, deconstructing, experimenting, asking people what they do, coming to sessions like this, learning, trying out new things. These things are still so new. There isn't the definitive textbook that says this is what you should do. And I don't know that there ever will be, because they are so embedded within that purpose, audience, message. The way I teach my students how to do some of this stuff, like I had to teach them, about TikTok, was to get them to go into the medium, to observe, see what they like, pull it apart. How do we, almost dissect it? Go, well, what are the elements here? What's working? What's not? How does this thing work? Pull it apart, put it back together again. It's really something that you have to develop some taste in, and then you'll get a feel for what works and what doesn't. It's quite tacit in terms of learning. So as I mentioned, I wanted to finish up on using social media specifically for research impact. That was the discussion that I was going to have, but I'll just hold off and we might be able to come back to that. So promoting your research can feel a little bit like busking to actually drive impact, whether that's actually having people reading the stuff who you want to read it, particularly if they're outside of academia, as well as some of the things that, for those of us in academia, that count, like some of the metrics. But social media can work really well with our conventional, and can work really well to promote our research. And this is the example that I'm going to give, which is actually one of mine. So exactly what Fran was talking about before in terms of altmetric, and I'm going to show you the altmetric, some screenshots from the altmetric dashboard. So as I've mentioned before, I do research on people's attitudes to biotechnology and food. So in 2017, I wrote a paper with my then manager, with my colleague, that on women's perceptions of genetically modified food, and we were interested too in their educational backgrounds, and we were able to show that it wasn't just educational background that determined women's attitudes to GM foods, but that it was a range of issues. Now, the paper came out, as you can see, on about the 8th of February 2017. We did actually convince the university to write a media release as well. I wrote most of it. So they put it out, but we also simultaneously had a piece pitched to The Conversation. So everyone's heard of The Conversation here. So The Conversation takes articles from academics. So we had a Conversation article lined up as well. So this is still about a week after it came out. We didn't have it lined up for the publication date. So we had the university media release and the Conversation article came back out. I then did at least 3 or 4 radio interviews, several radio interviews, including the rural press, because they were obviously interested in attitudes to GM foods, as well as the sort of more metropolitan ones. I think I did Drive in Newcastle or something else. Anyway, there was a whole range of them. Now, what happened was, because even though the paper was behind a firewall, because the Conversation article was then free to access, and the university's press release was free to access. We could drive social media to both of those things, and both of them cited the DOI of the original paper. So both of them then started to get picked up by Altmetrics. But the main thing was because we were tweeting this out and the link to the original paper, the journal said, you've got it trending, I'll make it open access. And so open access publishing usually requires the author to pay a lot of money so that people can access it. Some open access fees are in the thousands. So we got thousands of dollars worth of value by getting it trending on Twitter. And I mean trending, for a paper, we were not trending like Justin Bieber, we were trending like, I think it's about 6 retweets or something. But what then happened was, of course, the page views just went off. So my little paper in my weird social sciences journal has still had over 2,500 page views, which in my field is astonishing. It's still only been cited by about, 7 or so people. But as an early career researcher, that's still a story that I can tell in terms of my impact. And again, those people may not be in a situation where they would cite it. I'm much happier that 2,500 people have read it. So this, as you can see, the conversation, I took this screenshot yesterday because I wanted to update it. That particular article is down here, but this is all the articles that I've written in the conversation. All up, I've had over 113,000 readers from the 9 articles that I've written, and I was looking at it yesterday, and I hadn't noticed this jump before. Last time I looked at this, it was still tracking down here. It looks like that one at the top said 41,000 readers. When I'm sort of critiquing the idea that we shouldn't let plant-based juice be called milk because we're precious that people might get mixed up with that and dairy, I was kind of arguing against that, you can see. But that's just blown me away. I had no idea it had that many. This one had, the one that I'm talking here about, had about 12,000 readers. And you can look at the dashboard and you can see heaps there. Conversation is not necessarily applicable to everybody, but I think it's still a good way to get research impact. This is the Altmetric score of it though. So it's had 119 is the score. The colour codes to whether it's news, blogs, Twitter, video. Okay, so there's a different combination there. I think the blue is Twitter. And you can see that this is in the top 5% of all research articles scored by Altmetric. That's everything produced in the world ever. That means that there's a lot of stuff that never gets read by or never reaches the public domain. It's a very, very long tail in research publications. And you can see, oh, that's not the one I thought I had one at the bottom. So it had 21 tweeters. That was what got it trending on in the journal to get it open access. And that can be your friends. That actually doesn't matter. People have said to me, oh, is that gaming it? And I'm like, so one of the things was it did get picked up by somebody who had a very, very large following. So that was good. So that's the story that really using social media to drive research impact. I would never have had that impact before. And it's still the top 3, one of the top 3 for the journal. I think it's just there. Yeah, it's actually number 1 for that journal. Crazy. One of the biggest for 2020, not surprisingly. So 36,000 is kind of your upper limit, whereas one was 119. As I said, this is, like I said, is a very long tail. Not unsurprisingly, you can see that that one's very, very popular. However, the thing you to remember with Altmetric and all of these alternative metrics is that they still rely on popularity. This is still going to rely on those classic news values. So the most popular paper of 2019, pre-COVID, right? Remember 2019? Those heady days. This was the #1 research paper. It was about an AI that could make faces move. So that's quirky, not necessarily life-saving, okay? And in 2020, a paper about toilet paper, of course, made the media because it's quirky. And you also have to be really careful because this particular paper that was then retracted about saying that the careers of women who had women mentors were worse than those who had men mentors. The study was flawed. It was then retracted. It was still, of course, number 9 in terms of its popularity, partly because of the nature of it. So all metrics can be really useful, but they are, like with everything, there's caveats. But social media definitely, in my case, has been a way that I've been able to drive impact that as an early career researcher I wouldn't have been able to in any other way. The other thing is, of course, you've got that blogging function, and I was able to make my paper open access. Most of us, when we submit an article, we have our version that we submit that the university then keeps and makes available in their digital repository after an embargo period. You can always link to that. But usually, I mean, you can link to that too, but I mean, you can also, this one will be behind a firewall, again, depending on your audience. So remembering that there's always a free to access version, usually in your institutional library, and you should speak to your librarian about doing that.
How does that work for non-universities?
You can still keep that and put it on your own website, or, oh, not that one, ResearchGate, those kinds of things. But ResearchGate, remember, don't share the PDF of your formatted one. Only that one. So again, that's another way to drive your audience to your work and still have the academic credentials of your other staff, but making sure that people who are outside of firewall, the people who are outside of institutions can still read your work, which in ag is a lot of people, right? So ResearchGate can be really useful, but just be careful not to actually breach the copyright of your author agreements. So just to finish up, we covered a lot of ground today, but in terms of thinking about your communication goals, both whether it's research or whether it's more broadly, remember the old SMART goals, making sure that you consider your audiences, your purpose, your audience, your message, and then think about, well, there might be stuff I'll put on LinkedIn that I don't put on Twitter, or yeah, I do want to have a Facebook page, but that's a really different thing, or I want to try TikTok, or I want to try Instagram, maybe have a chat to Tina if you want to do that. I'm still trying to work out how TikTok could fit in. Again, what would my message be, and who would I want to speak to on TikTok, and how would I even get them to see my stuff based on the algorithms? So I'm just watching that one, is still in that stage. And I guess the last discussion that I was planning on inviting you to have with your colleagues was starting to, again, just have a chat, but discuss how some of this additional information might be useful. But I do think it's probably better at this point in time, looking at the overall time, to just open up for some questions on either social media or everything more broadly. And this can be your homework. So are there any questions for me about using social media for engagement more broadly, building that audience so that then when you have the free to access paper, you can drive them into it and you can get all your stuff happening? Yep.
Kathy? So just on Twitter,
yep.
How much time do you feel you need to put towards managing the comments and that sort of thing?
Right now, I don't actually spend a lot of time at all. And I'm managing 3 accounts. There's my own, the University of Western Australia's Biological Sciences account, and the University Science Communication. I do try to check every day, just a quick check, and I go straight to the mentions. I actually don't even bother looking in the feed now. I'm going straight to the mentions to see who's retweeted us. So for the 2 institutional, the organisational ones, it's mainly focusing there. But then for myself, I also then use it as my reading times of sort of going through. So I would say at the moment, probably if it's, 10 minutes a day, maybe an hour on one of the days on the weekend. But it did take a lot, back in the old days when I was working at the Weight Research Institute and I was participating in Ag Chat Oz every week, then it was hours. It was hours.
I was just going to say, I think it depends on it, but someone like Steve Powers, for example, who was Australian Herbicide Resistance Initiative, would spend an hour every morning just doing Twitter. So to make sure that he responded to any of the questions, the comments, the notifications, putting a little bit of feed in, but they had an enormous following, and that's how they grew that, was making that commitment to that time.
Yeah. Is online hearing that?
There's a question actually from Narelle.
Sorry, and then I'll come back to you. Yeah.
What's your thoughts on saturating tweets, i.e. heaps of tweets all the time versus enough to keep you on everyone's mind, or on LinkedIn?
I think in both cases, it is finding that sweet spot, enough to be on people's minds. Because of course there is the danger that if you do tweet all the time, there's an expectation that you're going to do that. Certainly when I pulled back, no one contacted me to ask me whether I was okay, which is a bit of a worry. But sometimes you can actually say, and I'm going to be off Twitter for a while, and tell people that you're going on leave and taking a break from it. Sometimes you need to. I think, again, it depends on what phase you're at. So I'm at a point where I'm not necessarily looking to grow my audience. I'm still trying to work out whether there's a new audience I need to grow. But I think if you were growing, then you would definitely want to be doing it more often than being at a point where it's like, okay, is this really serving me now? But I am hopefully going to actually publish some papers again soon. And that's again where I need to start preparing that audience for the stuff that I'm about to drop and making sure that there's the right people that need to read that. So some of the stuff around gene editing, I need to make sure that some of the people who are working in gene editing are actually paying attention to that. And I know that there's a group here, for example. And I think, there's other stuff around. So I co-supervise a student looking at sustainability communication in the beef industry. I've probably already got the right audience for that already. So there's a few different things that I need to start thinking about in terms of new areas that I'm developing. Yes.
I presume that accruing LinkedIn contacts is not a competition. So how do you decide whether or not to accept a LinkedIn invitation? So
I usually base it partly on whether I've met them or whether they are from a credible institution that I trust and acknowledge, and whether they're likely to be, I don't want to say of use because that sounds way too utilitarian, but whether we're likely to have a shared interest at some point in the future. If it's somebody that is just wanting to contact me so that they can say I'm in their network, then I'm not interested. But if it's somebody who I think who I'm going to have a shared interest with, then I accept.
So you have no problem with deleting the invites?
Yes, or not responding to them at all. Yeah.
I do reject them.
I do have several that I have said no to. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that's rude, because again, it's partly one of the best descriptions about social media, and also managing the trolls or the negative comments and curating this. This is like your house. You've decorated it, you've curated it, you've put all the objects in it, you've put the content there, you've developed the feel and the look. Okay, if the LinkedIn is the platform, but this is your house, and it's okay for you to say that people can't come in, or if they don't behave the way you want, you can ask them to leave, whether that's your Facebook page or your Twitter thread. And again, I'm talking back in the old days when we were all talking about blogging. What if someone puts a negative comment on your blog? Just say delete, and that's not there. Conversation will delete comments that are inappropriate. This is your house. You have curated the content. You have put in the time and effort to curate that content. It's not censorship. They can go and be horrible somewhere else, but this is my space.
I'll quite often click on their profile as well, and if it's a Facebook page and they've got a couple of photos with their mates drinking beers wherever, then I'll generally say, yeah, no thanks. Unless they've got the same discipline interest, or they're ag and it just happens to be an old photo and it's the.
And even by then they've burnt up some of your time.
Yeah.
What are the symptoms of digital overload?
For me personally,
needing a break.
Yeah, I think when you find that it's preventing you from doing things that you enjoy, or it's not actually giving you some kind of value. If it is just if it's a task, or it's making you feel bad either about yourself or the world, it's time to take a break and reground and bring people around you that love you take a break. And I would definitely advocate taking a break. At the moment, I've had a really challenging few years work-wise, and I'm not the kind of person who would share negative things on social media. I again, curate that very carefully, not just because I don't want to bring my employers into disrepute or anything like that, but also because I'm just not that kind of person. So I'd rather say nothing. If I'm having a bad day at work, I don't need to tell the world that I had a bad day at work. I can tell my son that. But that's just me, you know, and that's where, again, that door stops, you know, that I just don't do that.
I know you haven't really talked about Instagram, but I was wondering whether or not your advice would change, given that they now seem to have locked things down, that you have to have a Instagram account to be able to see anything there. Does that change?
Yes. I think, well, yeah, because Twitter you can actually see. Instagram, I think my rules would be similar. Obviously, it's a visual-based medium and you have to have really nice images, and the hashtagging is the same. And there's some of the other messaging things that they've brought in, but I think Facebook obviously now owns Instagram as well, and so they're differentiating their products there. If your audience is on Instagram, then go there, but maybe don't use it to build an audience in the same way. I haven't really thought about how Instagram's firewall, for want of a better word, might affect communication. I guess
I found it really, because I follow a number of people, but I follow them from other social media to their Instagram. So I found that making me very grumpy at the moment. So.
Yeah, I guess I have an Instagram as well. And so one of the things I do have is there's a thing called About Me. I've created a page that actually does have all of my socials on it, so that people can find me on all those things. And then the idea would be to have that on a QR code, stick it on the back of your business card, job's done. So people can find you anywhere.
And from the other opposite end of that, if you don't want to be on these social media platforms, I think that's a kind of a personal thing as well.
Absolutely.
How can you navigate so that you can provide your research perspective that can reach these amazing communities that you in the metrics?
And I think that's where the organisational accounts can come in. And if you don't want to do it personally, feeding that information into your organisation, whether it be Murdoch or DPIRD or whatever, and you know, letting them sort of handle that part for you, but still giving them the content.
Yeah. I guess you just kind of lose your, like if you're the key researcher on it, it loses kind of a lot of the value in you.
It does in part. You could still tell the stories, but yeah, people won't be able to Google you quite so easily and have that as part of your portfolio. And so in that case, you might be like, well, I'll just do one, and keep it very much work related. I am conscious of the time. Is there any more questions online, just to do one more?
There is one more from James. Is there a potential to lose trust by addressing too many audiences on a single platform? Can your message be diluted? To what degree does splitting your perceived persona across platforms fix this, or is it better to focus your attention on one or two specific audiences as an individual?
It depends on how radically different. So I think the first answer, or the first question about trust and the idea that if you split your personas up across many, is somebody going to say, you're different on Instagram to the way you are on Twitter, and why are you different? As long as your personas are still part of your authentic self, and these are just facets of yourself that you're choosing to show, I don't think there's any chance you'll lose trust. If you're acting like completely different people, then that might be questionable. The dilution of the message, I think the important thing is that you're tailoring your messages to your audiences, not the number of audiences or the number of messages. It then becomes a case of managing them. And the dilution is only if you can't continue to communicate or serve those audiences the information that they need or that you need them to have in order to achieve your goals. So I think that's probably the way I'd answer that one. Okay, I am on Twitter. We've covered a lot of ground today. That's my Twitter handle, and obviously I'm going to still be in touch with Tina and Fran as well. So if there is other follow-up, one of the things I will do is make in some form a bibliography available to you, because I know that I had lots of links and things up there, and I did mean to have that available today. So I'll find a way to make that available to you via Tina and for those online as well. And I think it's time for me to finish and to hand over to Fred.